Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Marvin Bird Show. I'm your host, Marvin Bird. Here, we believe that teachers are leaders, and as a result, we strive to equip teachers and aspiring teachers with skills and information that they need in order to lead their students to success. The essential question for the day is, what's the history of Black Americans as it relates to education? Once again, what is the history of Black Americans as it relates to education? A couple of episodes ago, we talked about a group of teachers who made what I believe was a terrible mistake, and they held up a slur for towards Black people, and I believe that they didn't know it. And as I was recording that episode, I threw out a possible solution that could have prevented that, and that is simply getting some education in regards to the experience of that particular minority group in this country. And perhaps throughout that journey, that study, those teachers would have learned, oh boy, that's a slur, and I better make sure that that word doesn't come out of my mouth while I'm around that student in the wrong context. And I just better be careful with that word around my black, as a white teacher, I better be careful with that word around my Black students. So to that end, it reminded me that I had started a series where I went through the history of the United States, and at I was looking at originally slaves in America, and their experiences with education. I was traveling throughout the history of the United States and just looking at how things have changed. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick that series back up. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to pick it up and at this time period, the post-Civil War time period. That's when we're going to pick this series back up, and we're just going to talk about education and how things changed. Obviously, you all know that, as slaves, obviously, blacks, they could not. They could not have access to an education. There were actually laws that prevented them from getting an education, and things are going to start to open up post Civil War, and that's what we're going to talk about today, and we'll probably get into it a little bit in the next edition of this series. But I'm really excited about today because there's going to, like I said, some things are going to open up, and what you're going to see is hopefully you're going to be able to identify some things that you are familiar with, and perhaps some things that you weren't familiar with, because they get a little bit deeper into the weeds. So to that end, what I want to do before we start the show is I want to say this. The purpose of this information that I'm about to share with you is to, like everything that I share on this show, is to help you be a better leader, so that in turn you can be a more efficient teacher, and you'll have a greater effect on your students and the decisions that they make, and their achievement is going to improve as a result of the things that I shared with you here. That's what this is all about. And with this information, I understand that if this information is not shared correctly, it can definitely be divisive. It can definitely shut people down. And I want you to know that I'm sensitive to that. And so that's why I'm telling you up front that the purpose of this is to share information to help improve your leadership. And it's not about affirming people, myself included, who already know the information. It's not about affirming them, allowing us to pat ourselves on the back and run on social media and criticize people who don't know the information. That's not what this is about. And this is me, and I would encourage everyone in education to really take a second look at that in terms of running on social media and criticizing people who don't know the information. Because as educators, we should celebrate people. We should celebrate people and make it easy for people. And I'm talking about our white colleagues. We should make it easy for them to come to the table to get this information. We should not, we shouldn't proactively criticize them. We should celebrate them and make it easy for them to get this information. And that's what this is all about. And so when I give you this information, it's definitely out of a place of service, out of a place of love. I'm talking to our white educators now, because I believe that when we do this the right way, it encourages people to come. When we do it the wrong way, when we proactively criticize people, what it does is it shuts them down. It shuts them down. It becomes divisive. It shuts them down. And then, we still are trying to navigate a teacher shortage. So the second thing that does when we deal with this information incorrectly is we discourage people, potential good educators, from even entering the field. So with this information, we need to be careful. We need to be very careful. You've got to have a good heart about it. And like I said before, you know what my purpose is. And so I truly believe 100% that my heart is in the right place as I share with you this information. And it is my desire that this information helps you, it changes you, and it could potentially help you from making a poor decision that could possibly be misconstrued as something that it's not. So I believe that was clear. I set a nice foundation. I really wanted to do that because I get that this information, at times it can be divisive. And the other thing, before I get into it, I promise you that you'll never ever know my political affiliation. So I'm not going to insert politics in this either, because once again, I don't want to shut you down. I've stated what my mission statement is. I've given you that already. And so I would be unfaithful to my mission statement if I were to insert my opinion or try to mold this information into a way that promotes my political affiliation. So I'm not going to do that either. I was thinking about this as I was getting ready to share this information with you. I was thinking, I gotta give you a foundation before we get into this. And like, I've been a part of PD sessions where, we're talking about equity, diversity, great things to talk about. But I've been a part of meetings throughout my years as an educator where, okay, I think politics is kind of entering into the picture. We may be molding things a little bit. We may be twisting things a little bit. And when that happens, as I said before, you're going to lose teachers. And for those of you who don't, who are interested in possibly, sharing and doing PD with teachers, just remember this, that, when teachers are sitting in your PD sessions, they have papers to grade, lessons to plan, and people to call. Papers to grade, lessons to plan, and people to call. When you're running a PD session, you have to keep that in mind. Your teachers, they have those things are running through their mind, and your job as a person who is leading professional development, you're competing with those things. Those things always have the potential of moving to the front of that teacher's mind. And when that's happened, they've shut down. They're not listening to what you have to say. So That's important. Keep that in mind for those of you who lead PD sessions. All right. So you ready for some facts? Ready for some facts? We're going to talk about history of Black Americans as it relates to education. And we're looking at the years 1865 to 1872. 1865 to 1872. So now it's the end of the Civil War. End of the Civil War. President Lincoln has, sadly, he's been assassinated. And so now the country is in this time period known as Reconstruction. We've got to rebuild the country once again. And at this time, there, with the politicians, there's a lot of disagreement and infighting. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Politicians can't agree on anything. And caught in the middle of that are these former slaves, but now they're freedmen. Former slaves, now they're freedmen. We call them freedmen now. And so now we've got all of these former slaves. They have been, they haven't had to make a lot of decisions that they're being asked to make now. And so now what do they do? How do they make these decisions? And the Congress, what they did agree on, they did agree to establish, to help these freedmen, they agreed to establish what's known as the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help freedmen get back on their feet. And the Freedmen's Bureau did a lot of things in terms of helping freedmen get jobs. They also helped them establish, legal affairs. For example, in terms of the freedmen were able to choose things such as their own last name. It was customary for slaves to have the last name of their owner. Now these newly freedmen, they get to choose their own last name. And one of the popular last names that was chosen was Freeman. Free man, Freeman. So now they're able to choose their last names. They're able to let the public acknowledge the fact that they're married. And so the Freedmen's Bureau handled a lot of those legal record keeping for these newly found freedmen. The other thing the Freedmen's Bureau did was they offered supplies and support to these freedmen as well. And last but not least, here we talk about education. The Freedmen's Bureau also offered resources to educate these newly freed men. Now, next up, I want to talk to you about how the Freedmen's Bureau was received in the South. Well, obviously, how do you think former slaveholders viewed the Freedmen's Bureau? Well, obviously, they viewed it as a waste of money. And I've got a primary source for you here. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can see this, and for those of you who are listening, I will explain it for you. But if you want to see this podcast, if you want to see this picture, definitely you can go to YouTube and just search The Marvin Bird Show. And while you're there, you can also subscribe, and there's also a bell so you can receive notifications when I drop a new episode. So, no, that's not the picture I want to share with you. This is what I wanted to share with you. So this really sums it up. There was, in the newspapers, because they didn't have good internet in the South in 1865, so they shared a lot of their opinions in the newspapers. So this picture right here, this is a political cartoon. This is someone's depiction of the Freedmen's Bureau. The popular, and it reads at the bottom, the popular idea of the Freedmen's Bureau: plenty to eat and nothing to do. And here in the middle, we see a couple of freedmen, actually three freedmen. But in the front here, we see a couple of freedmen. One is sitting down playing the banjo. Another one is sitting on a bag of corn, and just surrounding these freedmen who are doing nothing. As the caption says, there's food, there's pork, corn, flour, And in the back is another freedman who is falling asleep, and they have all of this is taking place in front of a sign that has the Freedmen's Bureau on it. And so clearly you can see that the point is being made and the point is being hammered home that the Freedmen's Bureau is for, it's for these lazy former slaves. They're getting all of this assistance from the government and they're doing nothing to earn it. They don't deserve it. So the South is just really hammering this point home, and that's going to be important because the Freedmen's Bureau isn't going to be around very long. And you can imagine with these families that were in bondage. Now you freed them. It's going to take you can imagine it's going to take a long time to help them get back on their feet, to help them understand how to support themselves. But with things like the political cartoon I showed you, it's going to be very effective to put an end to the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll talk about that a little later. So along with the Freedmen's Bureau came a program that provided freedmen with 40 acres of land to work, because obviously the freedmen, they knew that they knew how to work land. And back then, if you had land, you had an opportunity. Land equals an opportunity. And this program, just it became known, it was just the 40 acres, but then a mule got attached to it and the program became known as 40 acres and a mule. And so this was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful opportunity given to freedmen. It was around 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land. It was confiscated from Confederates during the war, and it was redistributed to these freedmen to help them get back on their feet. Now, seems like we're going places. We've got this Freedmen's Bureau that's helping freedmen get back on their feet. We've got the 40 acres and a mule program. Wow, this sounds amazing. However, like I said before, political pressure, political cartoons like the ones that I showed you, they're going to be effective in shortening the lifespan of the Freedmen's Bureau. And sadly, it's sad but true, this 40 acres and a mule program was reversed very it was reversed soon after it was created, and that was just very, very sad and depressing for these freedmen, because once again, that land represented an opportunity. And we're going to talk about what the effects of that is going to be for freedmen and how it's going to affect their education, and as well as the educational legacy of their families. So the status of the South this time, because politicians couldn't agree. Now, let me give you a little bit of background. So at this time, this is going to shift your brain. At this time, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He became a Republican because he decided to split from his former party, because that party was not as against slavery as he was. So that's how the Republican Party started. So Abraham Lincoln was he was a Republican. And what you'll need to know is that we're talking about, Republicans are the ones who are in Congress now, and they're leading the legislative branch of the government. So we've got a Republican in the White House and Lincoln, and now that Lincoln is dead, his vice president Andrew Johnson is in power. But amongst these Republicans, you have there's a there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum amongst these Republicans in terms of, on one side you have Republicans who are called, who they want to go easy. They want to take it easy on the South to bring the South back into the United States. They're saying, okay, guys, we won the war. We made our point. Let's bring the Southern states back into the Union. Let's just come on back. You shouldn't have done that. Let's give a little slap on the hand. You shouldn't have done that. What you did was wrong. What you did was wrong. But we'll bring you back into the Union. Come on, you just make sure you pass a constitution, pass a state constitution, and then you can come back into the Union. Come on back. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. And then on the other hand, you have what are called the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans. Now, these radical Republicans, they wanted they wanted the South to really pay a heavy price. And when I say the South, they wanted the leaders of the Confederacy to pay a heavy, heavy price. They really wanted to punish them. And so you had this disagreement between these lenient Republicans and Andrew Johnson, the president at this time. He's viewed as a lenient kind of Republican. And so you have the lenient Republicans and then the radical Republicans, and they're fighting together because they want to make it right. Radical Republicans are the ones who primarily they are concerned with what's going to happen to the freedmen. And so the Southern states, they start passing state constitutions, and they, submit their application to be readmitted back into the Union. And so things are moving along. They're coming back. And in these state constitutions, the radical Republicans are realizing that, hey, wait a second. With these state constitutions, all it does is it puts it doesn't help the freedmen, and it puts the same people who were in power before the Civil War, puts them back in power. So the radical Republicans, they intervene, they override President Johnson, and they put a stop to those state constitutions. And what they do is they start what was called military reconstruction. So the Congress, led by these radical Republicans, they're going to send troops down into the South, and they're going to divide the South up into military districts, and they send troops to the South to occupy the South until all of these states can pass a reasonable state constitution that protects the rights of the freedmen. And when they're able to do that, when they pass a state constitution that acknowledges and protects the rights of the freedmen, only then will they be allowed to come back into the Union. So that's what's going on in the South. There's a lot there, but I want to share with you, our YouTube watchers, and once again, you can check this out and you can subscribe to this YouTube channel, The Marvin Bird Show, and hit the bell to receive notifications. So when we talk about military reconstruction was so important. And this picture, I believe, illustrates the importance of military reconstruction, because as you can see here, we have a soldier in the middle. He's got his uniform on. He's got the U.S. flag above him. He's standing in the middle of, we have a group of white people. We have a group of freedmen. And you can imagine that things must have been pretty bad at this time. And for sure they were. And that's why it was so important that the military was there to make sure that that peace was preserved in the South during this time, as they're trying to figure out what they need to do in order to be readmitted back into the Union. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the funding of the Freedmen's Bureau. But before we get to that, what I want to do is I want to share this with you. Birdlinks.com, birdlinks.com, birdlinks.com. Birdlinks.com is the place for you to go to get all of your education news in one convenient location. One convenient location here. The top story, we're talking about the new CDC guidelines regarding 3 feet of spacing instead of 6. We'll see how that goes. And then other stories that we have on here: 5 research-backed tips to improve your online teaching presence. That's going to be something that you'll want to look into, especially if you're still teaching online. And then the long-awaited return to schools in Long Beach, California. They've been closed down a long time, and so this is breaking news that they've opened up. So there's those stories and so many more on birdlinks.com. So please make birdlinks.com one of your go-to places every day for information. All right. Now back to this. We're talking about the funding. So initially, $500,000 was allocated to build 3,000 schools and educate about 150,000 students. Now, remember, this is something that has never, ever been done before. And the Republicans, they understood that the Democrats in the South, that, they understood what they would say in opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau. Something like this had never been done before. And I would, and because of that, I think that's why, because of some of the backlash they knew that they were going to receive, I believe that's why, they only allocated $500,000 for this project. $500,000 was not enough to educate these students. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. And ultimately, what's going to happen is white Southerners, they're going to eventually regain power, and funding for this program is going to dry up. But a really cool thing I found in my research is that there were a lot of local communities and charities. They also put up some money to educate students. Now let's talk about the teachers. Let's talk about the teachers. The teachers here, we have a lot of white teachers. They're performing missionary work from the American Missionary Association, and they're a group that worked really hard to abolish slavery. And they're going to send teachers from the North to the South. Additionally, you had black teachers who came from the North to the South to educate students. But what's going to be awesome is I'm going to share with you about the colleges later, is that by the late 1860s, you had a large crop of black teachers who were educated in these newly created colleges. They're going to enter into the teaching field to help educate these students as well. Now, the other interesting thing is that blacks were already running schools before the Civil War was over. Blacks were already running secret schools before the war was over. And once the war was over, once they had the opportunity, they threw open those doors and they welcomed students with open arms to come on in. And sadly, it is true that these teachers were attacked. They were attacked for what they were doing. They experienced violence, and that's why it was so important that the military was present in the South. But I'm going to talk about what happens that eventually removes the military, because once the military is gone, then it's just going to be open season on these freedmen and anybody who wants to help them. So I have a couple of primary sources that I want to share with you. These are observations given from teachers themselves at this time. Since the return of so many rebel soldiers, there are evidently more manifestations of displeasure at the colored schools. They often stop to stare into the schoolroom to see what is going on. I don't think they take the proceeding kindly at all. Here's another one. The white rowdies are doing what they can to put down the schools. They commenced taking what they could find in our schoolrooms. We had locks on the desks and doors. They pressed off the locks and took books and slates. So there are numerous sources out there of teachers giving that kind of account where they're experiencing violence and resistance from white Southerners against what they're doing in terms of trying to educate newly freed men. Again, this is important because if these kids can't be educated, if they can't be educated, what'll ultimately happen is you're going to have a cycle of poverty in the black community, a cycle of poverty in the black community. Now imagine if this continues on for one generation, two generations, three generations. What is the long-term effect of that? Think about that. All right. So the end of the Freedmen's Bureau, there was always political pressure to end the Freedmen's Bureau. The life of the Freedmen's Bureau only lasts from 1865 to 1872. When you have a lot of former slave owners, they're going to slowly but surely, they're going to start taking control of the South. And the government in DC, they're going to start, the radical Republicans are going to start giving ground. And then we're going to have presidents who are weak in terms of supporting the freedmen. And that, along with just the political pressure from the South, is going to just force the South to eventually dismantle the Freedmen's Bureau and leave so many vulnerable freedmen just hanging unprotected and uneducated. And as I said before, there's just going to be this perpetual cycle of inequality, and largely it's going to be due to this. Think about this. So now the Freedmen's Bureau is no more. There are limited funds for education. So how do you kill education for freedmen? So check this out. Now that former slave owners, they're starting to slowly but surely gain power, they obviously don't like that the freedmen they're seeking an education. So they've successfully killed the Freedmen's Bureau. So that resource is gone. Now that the slave owners, they're in charge of the states, they're in charge of public education as well. And this is going to be how they further push freedmen into that cycle of poverty, because they now control education. Now they can make the education of freedmen less than the education of white people. And this is how it starts in public education. So for example, in North Carolina, they use local taxes to determine the funding of schools. Well, obviously, the fact that schools are segregated, like, that's off the top. We knew that was going to be the case. So now we have segregated schools. The communities are also segregated. So now the fact that we're using the local taxes to determine that a lot of that funding, additional funding for schools, you can imagine the freedmen communities, they're not bringing in as many tax dollars as the white communities. So that's one way they push down the level of education that freedmen received, and basically persuaded them, to a lot of freedmen, to just give up the idea of education. At this time also, we see that black teachers are making significantly less than white teachers. And also for black people, you're going to see states make it even more difficult for black people to obtain a teaching certificate. And overall, the resources they're not going to be equally distributed. And so this was a huge test to the resilience of black people at this time. Now, for sure, black people are very resilient in enduring slavery, and continue, and even pursuing education in slavery when it was against the law. And so during this time, even though the Freedmen's Bureau is no longer around, you're going to see black people, they still want to receive an education, even though the resources aren't the best. they're still going to try their very best to pursue all the education that they can get. When I talk about this perpetual cycle of poverty, what am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about how you have generation after generation. They are not, they're not, they're not making leaps from one generation to the next. Instead, it's a cycle of poverty. And largely what I'm talking about is I'm talking about sharecropping. Sharecropping. Many families had to resort to sharecropping because they didn't have a whole lot of economic opportunities available to them. And the educational opportunities were limited as well. Educational opportunities were limited as well. So sharecropping. Sharecropping works like this. You have a former Confederate landowner. Confederate still has his land. He doesn't have the free labor that he used to have. So he'll go to his former slaves and say, hey, here's what I'll do for you. I'll let you work a portion of my land. And in return for working a portion of my land, when you get your crops, you give me, let's say 20%. Okay. You give me 20% once you get your crop in, and that'll be the cost of using my land. So what that what that former slave owner will do is they'll go to well, hold on. Before we get to that part, so we have what seems like an interesting deal for the freedman, right? Interesting deal for the freedman. Okay, work this land. Yeah, pay 20% once I'm done. Once I have my crops, seems like a good deal. But the freedman, remember, the freedman's been a slave all their life, so they don't have a lot of resources. So what is this freedman going to need in order to produce a crop? Yeah, they're going to need seed. They're going to need tools. So they'll have to go to the store to get those things. So what they don't know is there's been a deal made between the former slave owner and the store owner that what we're going to do is we're going to jack up the cost on the former slave. We're going to jack up the costs, and we're going to situate it in a way that once the crop has come in, the freedman is still in debt to either the landowner or the store. So what happens is they're going to have to do that again and again and again and again, to the point where the freedman never gets ahead on those payments. They never get ahead on that balance. So basically, the freedman is once again a slave. And if they were to realize what's going on, that they're in this cycle of debt that they'll never get out, if they try to get out of it, if they try to stop working the land, then the slave owner and the store owner, they have the force of law behind them to say, hey, you breached this contract, so now you're going to jail. And at this time, when they were sending people to jail, freedmen included, when they were sending them to jail, they were then leasing out their labor to former slaves. And so that's how this cycle of poverty just continued on and on and on for generations. Now think about the things that were missed out on in terms of opportunity, in terms of education, in terms of the ability to stair step things, to make the next generation better than the one that preceded it. Because that's what life is all about. That's what we want for all of our children. So we want them to have a better life than we had. We want our grandchildren to have a better life. We want them to make a mark, do something positive, live a good life, help people, make the world a better place. That's what we want. But for freedmen, it was impossible for them to really have that impact. And I submit to you is largely because the educational opportunities were taken away from them. And of course, the KKK, they saw this as a green light on freedmen. Now that they don't have the support and the protection of the military there, that now this is just a green light to terrorize black people in the South for the act of simply trying to get an education. And obviously the violence would increase once military reconstruction was over. So a few interesting facts about historically black colleges and universities. A lot of them, you can imagine, they started as a result of the Freedmen's Bureau. So during the time that we're talking about, Hampton in Virginia. We also have Howard University that was named after one of the leaders of the Freedmen's Bureau. And then there's Fisk University in Nashville, and we could just go on and on. There's a lot of colleges that are still in existence today. HBCUs is what we call them. They're still in existence today as a result of the Freedmen's Bureau. So, you can just only imagine what could have been, had the Freedmen's Bureau been able to stick around, had the politicians been able to kind of get their act straight and get on the same page, because largely we're talking about politicians of the same party just trying to get on the same page. Remember those lenient Republicans and those radical Republicans, we're talking about them just really trying to get on the same page, and sadly they couldn't. And so we get to the point of this show. What can you do with this information? What can you do with this information? Well, obviously you can keep it in your mind. And once again, ponder the question, how could things be different for your students? If you have black students in your class, how could things be different for your students if the history was a little bit kinder, if this Freedmen's Bureau would have stuck around a little bit longer, if the Freedmen's Bureau had been properly supported from the beginning? Think about the position your students could possibly be in today. Possibly, would they be eating free or reduced lunch? Is it possible that if things were different, they might not be eating free or reduced lunch? Is it possible that if freedmen were fully supported during this time, that some of your black students would not be considered at risk? Is it possible? Is it possible? And that's what I want you to do with this information. Just think about it. Because I think that what happens is, no, I know that what happens is that we see the anger coming from Black America, Black parents, and sometimes it's not properly processed. It's not properly processed because a lot of times, especially as teachers, we're trained to look at what's in front of us. We're trained to look at, okay, this is the data. These are the facts. But there are a lot of times where you are dealing with parents, Black parents, who like this stuff, they know this stuff. They know this history, or they're living with they lament these decisions that were made back then. Perhaps they view you, if you're a white educator, they view you as a threat because of these things that went on back then. Like that's why we all have to keep this information at the front of our mind and be sensitive to how even though it happened a long time ago, we have to be sensitive to how it could be affecting people today. And also, what I would encourage you to do is make this a part of your why. Make it a part of your why. You know, as white educators, even as black educators, educators of color, you know, we weren't there. We didn't cause it. Maybe even for some white educators who are watching this, your ancestors weren't even in this country when this stuff was going on. But what you could do is you can make this a part of your why. Why did you get into teaching? What is it that you hope to accomplish? Because these things, what we can do with our teaching is we can help to reverse, help to reverse the damage that was done by really digging in and helping those students, loving them and opening up their eyes, helping them determine their vision of success, and boom, sending them on their way to chase their vision of success and beyond. You're reversing the damage that was done so many years ago. And also, when you're aware of this information, you are a part of the solution, period. You're part of the solution, period. And if you feel like empowered, then I've done my job. If you feel empowered by knowing this information, by understanding that, you know, the effects of this history, they still live on, and there's something that you can do, then I have done my job. I've done my job. So definitely think about that. I know that that's a lot of information, but it is relevant information, and I look forward to continuing on in this series. And I do thank you all so much for listening to that information about the Freedmen's Bureau. And we're going to continue on in that journey and looking and exploring the education of Black Americans, and we'll continue that journey. So thank you so much for listening and watching. And until we meet again, please never, ever, ever forget that teachers are leaders.